Welcome back to the CFOS, folks, for the last reading of today. And we've done three devotion times, one, A Christian Reads the Quran, and now we are in The Battle for Christmas, The History of Christmas in the United States by Stefan Nissenbaum. It's a cultural history of America's most cherished holiday, Pulitzer Prize finalist. And that's the book right there. If you want to look it up on Amazon, and I'm sure it's still selling. It's an older book. I think it was 1991 for the copyright, 1996 for the copyright. Well, we're going to finish up chapter 6, and then chapter 7's it. It's the last chapter, and we may do the epilogue after that, but we're almost finished. We're getting through this book. And I think the next book I'm going to go into after this book, just to let you know, is On the Christian Life by John Calvin. And then after that, I got one by Doug Wilson. And then after that, I'm thinking to do one on the trustworthiness of the Bible. But I'll have to think about that because it's not going to take long to get through those other two books. Goal is to finish this one by the end of February, and we are going to make that goal. All right, we're going to pick up on 251, charity as spectator sport. By the final decade of the 19th century, well-to-do New Yorkers had begun to arrange new and larger kinds of Christmas visitations to the poor. And these gala events reeked strongly of exploitation. During the 1890s, some New Yorkers began to treat charity almost literally as a kind of spectator sport. Performed on a large scale in arena-like spaces before a paying audience on Christmas Day, 1890. This is the 1890s version of virtue signaling. I can see this already. Virtue signaling is not a new thing, folks. And I can say it the way I want to say it. I want to say the and it turns out as being virtue signaling, then I will do so because I can't speak right. Okay. But virtue signaling has been around a long time, since the fall of humanity. On Christmas Day, 1890, a midday dinner was served to 1,800 or 1,800 poor boys, many of them newsboys, at Lyric Hall, a theater at the corner of 6th Avenue and 42nd Street. A newspaper account made clear what was taking place. Quote, every flower was crowded with lookers on, principally members of the Children's Aid Society and other charitable people, end quote. This meal was followed that same evening by the traditional dinners held at every newsboy's lodging house in the city. It was as if the newsboys were being asked to put on performances at different holiday venues, as if there were something erotically charged about watching hungry children eat. The next year, a newly formed organization, the Christmas Society, held a massive gift distribution at the newly constructed Madison Square Garden, an event attended by some 10,000 needy children, many of whom were accompanied by their mothers. Gifts were attached to a series of ropes that, in turn, were attached by pulleys to the roof of the garden. The organizers of this event planned to attract the children of wealthy families as spectators, but few attended. One headline read, "Thousands of little ones made happy in Madison Square Garden. Children of the rich stayed away." Wealthy children were apparently not interested in watching hordes of their less fortunate peers, but the parents of those wealthy children soon proved susceptible to the lure. It was, of all things, the Salvation Army that provided them with the opportunity. Beginning in 1898, this organization's army of Christian soldiers organized immense public dinners for impoverished New Yorkers held at Square Garden. These dinners were great public spectacles, expertly organized. As the hungry and homeless were fed at tables on the arena floor under the glare of electric lights, more prosperous New Yorkers paid to be admitted to the garden's boxes and galleries where they observed the gorging. I have a question. If you feed a poor child on Christmas Day, will that last him the rest of the year? The event was reported as a front page story in the New York Times with a headline that announced in block letters, "The rich saw them feast." The press reported in detail how nearly 20,000 men, women, and children gathered from the highways and byways of the city in one great surging throng, waiting patiently to be admitted to enter the arena. The crowd was quite was the crowd was kept waiting until after the spectators had been admitted through a separate entrance. Quote, to the Madison Avenue entrance came the spectators of the extraordinary scene. Men in high hats, women in costly wraps, the great concourse of the prosperous and happy. They were to furnish the lighter side to the pleasure with their air of contentment and prosperity and perchance sympathy. At the other entrance of the garden, on Fourth Avenue, gathered the pilgrims from the illimitable abodes of poverty and wretchedness. End quote. The several thousand wealthy observers entered first so that they could look on as the hungry multitude was admitted. In the boxes and gallery of the great building, the story ran, sat many thousands of well-fed and prosperous people, among them many women who had come in carriages and were gorgeously gowned and wore many diamonds, who looked on in happy sympathy, who had come to see the spectacle of thousands being made happy. I can see where people can say in circumstances like this, please don't patronize me. There were four large sections of tables on the arena floor, and it was there that the poor, sitting in the upper gallery till their turn was called, were fed 2,200 at a time. This was a charity event on an industrial scale, a kind of Gilded Age version of Bracebridge Hall, in which the entertainment itself was produced on an assembly line. Even so, the food ran out before everyone could be served. Before the meal, both rich and poor joined together in singing the hymn, Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. That's how it goes. The hymn was sung in unison, position and fortune forgotten for one brief moment. It was a moving occasion, the Times reporter wrote. The pathos of it all was in the expression contained in the smiles of thanks. In the world of logic, there are three types. There's pathos, there's ethos, and there's logos. Logos, logic, ethos, ethics, and pathos is emotion. So the pathos of it all, the emotion of it all, was in the expression contained in the smiles of thanks. And the reporter concluded hopefully, suggesting that the very scale of the event foretold an imminent solution to the vexing problems of capitalism. Neither any continental city nor even London ever had to do anything approaching this in magnitude. It means the dawning of a new era, the bridging of the gulf between the rich and the poor. Only a single report in the New York World suggested that what happened was more a matter of Voyeurism than of class reconciliation. Quote, some seem to look upon this feeding of the ravens as a spectacle, and whispered and pointed at poorly clad men and women who ate ravenously or smiled when a piece of turkey was surreptitiously slipped into a capacious pocket. There was still another strange twist. The Salvation Army hit upon a novel fashion. The Salvation Army hit upon a novel fashion for raising funds to pay for these events. They hired employed men to play the part of straight corner Santa Claus, soliciting bypassers for contributions as they did their Christmas shopping. Ding ding, ringing the bell. This technique is still employed by the Salvation Army. Yeah, I saw some in front of Walmart this Christmas. Given a long history of the transformation of Christmas in the 19th century, there was irony as well as in there was irony as well as ingenuity in this tactic. For what it did was to recreate the structure, though not the substance, of a much older ritual in which the poor were informally sanctioned to approach the rich during the Christmas season and beg for gifts. Even the fact that the needy men who acted as street corner Santas were begging in disguise as deeply rooted in the mumming tradition. After all, Belsnickles had done much the same thing in Pennsylvania towns, at least as late as the 1870s. But of course, what the Salvation Army Santas were doing was profoundly different from older forms of Christmas wassailing and mumming. Their public begging was sanctioned only because they were not soliciting for themselves. They did not get to keep the money, but had to turn it over to the organization for which they worked. They were, in fact, the paid employees of a charitable organization. It is not clear whether they were paid a flat rate or a percentage of what they raised. Perhaps these Santas were also permitted to attend the Madison Square Garden dinners they themselves had helped to make possible. But even if they were, it would only be because they had been given a ticket of admission by their employers. In that sense, the entire Santa Claus ritual was nothing less than a microcosm of the workings of 19th century capitalism itself. The next section is Revenge of the Newsboys, the return of youth misrule. There was a final twist to this story, a twist that reveals still another microcosm. In 1902, we finally made it to the 1900s, folks. The 20, no, was that? Yeah, that was the 20th century. 1900s, 20th century. I was born in the 1900s. What? The old mind is, this is why I read. The old mind it cannot depart. Okay, here we go. Hope that was funny. In 1902, the Salvation Army's charity dinner was moved from Madison Square Garden to another arena, the Grand Central Palace. Once again, 20,000 people were fed. By this time, the event failed to go exactly as planned. The problem resulted from the fact that approximately 1,000 of the banqueters were young people, most of them newsboys, and they were seated separately in sections of their own at the two ends of the hall. These arrangements proved to be a mistake. Charles Loring Brace would have known better, but he had been dead for a dozen years. The youth took advantage of the opportunity to engage in activities other than eating. Quote, They made so much noise that for a time it was thought they would break up the religious meeting that followed. They hurled pies and every other thing they could lay their hands on at one another, and even at those who waited on them. End quote. The story in the Tribune reported what happened in deadpan language and considerable detail. Quote, General Daniel E. Sickles and his daughter, Miss Mary Sickles, who were among the invited guests, attracted considerable attention. They spent most of the time entertaining the boys. Miss Sickles carried a Blenheim Spaniel, a fancy breed, in her arms, dog. She called it Balwer, a fancy name. When the boys set their eyes on Balwer, they began hurling mince pies and turkey at him. Miss Sickles was taken by surprise, and yet Bulwer slipped from her arms to the floor. Bulwer ran over to where General Sickles was seated. The boys set up a great shout and hurled knives, forks, and spoons at him. Then they began cheering and shouting to General Sickles to make a speech. He laughed and said he was not able to do so. End quote. Finally, order disintegrated completely. There was an apparent shortage of mince pie for a time, and the youngsters thought that they were being overlooked. They began hurling bread and potatoes at those who waited on them and said that they did not want turkey, they wanted more pie. Miss Sickles went into the kitchen and came out a minute later with her arms laden with pieces of pie. 3 cheers for Mama, they shouted the urchins, and they made a rush to take the pie from her. Miss Sickles pleaded with them to keep quiet and be patient, but they would have none of her advice. One boy, whom another called Pinky, upset one of the plates on which were piled a number of pieces of pie, and there was a wild scramble to see who could get the most. Miss Sickles put the other plate of pie on the table and fled in dismay. End quote. The organizers learned their lesson. The next year, a somewhat smaller group of young people were invited, again, most of them newsboys. And this time of organizers had taken precaution. The boys were arranged in a corner of the hall, all by themselves, where they could give vent to their boyish caprices without disturbing the more sedate. The tactic seems to have worked. The youths occasionally let out a deafening war whoop just to break the monopoly and the monotony, I should say, and let other folk know they were there. But apparently, that was all. 2 years later, in 1905, 600 newsboys attended, and as many as 10 policemen were assigned to control them. Yeah. Even so, a substantial number were ejected from the hall during the course of the meal. Well, I guess it's not working out too well, is it? With such traditions of misrule emerging, in the very midst of this kind of spectacle event, an event devised by and in large measure for the well-to-do who came to observe the fruits of their charity, we have come full circle. Newsboys, as we know, had long been prone to such behavior at Christmas. As poor and youthful males, they came from the single social demographic group that had been most closely associated with Christmas misrule from at least as early as the 16th century. A newsboy reported one of the Christmas dinners held in 1895 at a newsboy's lodging house made it clear that the newsboys' rowdy behavior was not mere random chaos, but the expression of an elaborate and venerable ritual. The reporter explained it this way. There are many quaint and quaint customs among the newsboys which are strictly kept on Christmas, and which led originally to their doings at their dinners. For one thing, they would never deign to dress up on such occasions. All the newsboys came to their everyday. All the newsboys came, or all the newsboys come in their everyday clothes. Anyone who would have ventured to present himself in his best suit would have been regarded by the other lads as aspiring tear shine and upper crust. And they insisted on eating their Christmas dinners in a particular sequence, beginning with dessert. They always begin to eat a dinner by disposing of the pies, the puddings, and other dessert dishes first. Each lad gets away with several large-sized pies and seldom tastes a pudding if there are any pies in sight. Then comes the turkey and the cranberry sauce. The newsboys had a reason then to disrupt the 1902 Salvation Army dinner. The food was not being served in the proper sequence, and there were not enough pies. As the report of that chaotic event pointed out, they began hurling bread and potatoes at those who waited on them, and said that they did not want turkey, but wanted more pie. The newsboys' reversal of the standard dinner sequence was itself a kind of misrule, inverting the normal order of things. The pie throwing itself was probably part of the ritual, but there was probably a more important reason as well for the newsboys' behavior. For if Christmas charity had become a spectacle sport for the well to do, well, that meant it had become a form of what E.P. Thomas, referring to 18th century England, has termed political theater. In this case, it was theater in the most literal sense, complete with an arena equipped with a stage floor and galleries, as well as a separate entrance for the paying audience. The well to do New York spectators expected the poor to perform for them, as it were, by eating their Christmas meal with manifest gusto and gratitude. But from this perspective, it is also fair to say that the spectators were putting on a performance of their own by dressing up in their gorgeous gowns and flashiest jewelry. There was an earlier precedent for that, too. E.P. Thomas has also proposed that 18th century gentry theater provided or provoked a kind of response, counter theater, on the part of the plebeians themselves, a dramatic assertion of their own identity, thrown mockingly back in the face of the gentry. And so, with the newsboys in later day New York, the taunts and the pie throwing, like the refusal to dress up, are understandable enough. These boys were hungry, after all, and the banquet they were being given was almost certainly the best food they would get all year. Yet it was surely the meaning to the newsboys that their own pleasure was also a spectacle to be observed by the rich. Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier. As early as 1876, a story about the annual dinner implicitly conveyed this point. Even though the reporter ascribes the boy's reaction to being watched to mere self-consciousness, to appreciate the enjoyment of these boys properly, one would have to see them when they sit down to hide away the ribs of beef. The story began, only to continue with the acknowledgement that unfortunately It will not do to be seen when seen. For your newsboy, brave and sometimes impenitent, as he sometimes is upon the street, is as sensitive when he has his knees under the table as if he had been brought up in a hothouse and was most sensitive plant that grows. Ostensibly, then, the newsboy's display of misrule was a matter of mere juvenile high jinks. But surely it was also a form of counter theater aimed at those who were observing them, as the 1903 New York Times reporter put it. They let out a deafening war whoop just to let other folk know they were there. This counter theater served as a gesture that was meant to restore some of the dignity the newsboys had lost by being forced to make their own hunger a matter of public display. Among other things, it announced that they weren't so thoroughly dependent on their mince pies or their patrons that they couldn't afford to engage in a dramatic gesture of wasting the former by throwing them at the latter. In the process, the newsboys managed to make the most important point of all. They might be known as Peaky or Pickle Nose or Know Nothing Mike, but whatever they were called, it would not be Tiny Tim. Thank you for watching. And we'll be in chapter 7 next, and probably, let me take a guess here, 3, maybe 4, I'm gonna say 4 to 5 readings to get through chapter 7. And then epilogue, The Ghost of Christmas Past. We should do that one. All right. Thank you for watching. If you are watching, is anybody watching? Is anybody out there? Anybody out there? Anyway, thank you. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And I'm going to continue this. We're going to do book after book after book. It should be fun. Of different types of book, different varieties. So if you catch a book that you think you'd be interested in, tune in and I'll read it to you. And we'll go from there. God bless. I'll see you next time here on the C Files. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.